7 weeks before the drought turned every well in Cochise County into a dry stone throat, Angela Rearn was already paying the price for a decision nobody understood. A buckboard wagon rolled slowly along the dirt track leading to the Sand Creek Ranch. Resting on the wagon bed was a single canvas satchel, a folded wool blanket, a battered leather hackamore without a bit, and a small tin of tobacco her father had once carried in his coat pocket. Dust clung to the wheels. The Arizona sun bleached the boards of the buckboard almost white. Men resting along the corral fence stopped what they were doing to watch. Some simply stared, some shook their heads. One of them, a broad-shouldered foreman named Jack Halloran, laughed out loud. "A widow with a bridle and no bit," he said, "has no business showing up at a ranch where 2 men have already died." Angela heard him. So did the black mare pulling her wagon. The wagon kept moving. The laughter stayed behind. What nobody knew that afternoon in late April of 1889 was that the sky above the San Pedro Valley had already begun making a quiet decision, and the Mustang Stallion penned behind the tallest corral would soon answer a question the entire region thought it already understood. Before she ever reached the Sand Creek Ranch, Angela Rearn had already buried one future. Her husband, Thomas Rearn, died of a broken back the previous November, thrown from a green colt during the second week of a training contract that was supposed to pay their debts through winter. What remained behind was a rented adobe on the outskirts of Benson, an unpaid farrier's bill, and a folded sheet of paper the ranchers of Sand Creek had signed 6 months earlier. The contract promised $60, half up front, half on delivery, to any man who could gentle the captured stallion the vaqueros had begun calling El Diablo. Thomas had spent the first $30 the week he died. The ranch still wanted its work. Angela still wanted her second $30. The horse waiting for her in the corral was not a horse most trainers wished to meet. 2 men had already tried. The first, a bronc rider out of Tombstone named Herrera, had been kicked into the top rail with such force that his ribs collapsed inward before the sun reached noon. He lived 11 days after. The second man, a Texan called Whit Palmer, had trusted a snubbing post and a heavy Spanish bit. The stallion tore the post clean out of the ground with the man still attached to the rope and dragged him nearly 40 yards across the corral before the ranch hands could drop the animal with a lariat. Palmer lived long enough to drink 1 cup of water. That was all. Most people in Benson had advised Angela to sell the contract to another trainer. The money could have bought flour, boots, cloth for repairs, enough salt beef to carry her through the summer without begging. Instead, Angela sold Thomas's silver spurs. She sold the pair of good roping saddles hanging in the shed. She left her mother's writing desk with a neighbor. Even her wedding ring, a plain gold band worn thin by 6 years of ranch work, was passed across a counter in a Tucson pawn shop. The contract remained. $60 would not raise the dead. It could, however, keep the living from becoming beggars before the first cottonwood turned yellow. The Sand Creek Ranch sat at the base of the Dragoon Mountains, a long adobe main house with a red tile roof, 3 barns, 6 corrals, and a bunkhouse that leaned slightly to the east from years of prevailing wind. When Angela's wagon rolled into the yard, work stopped. A dozen ranch hands set down their coiled ropes and drifted toward the fence line. Some carried tin cups of coffee. Some carried nothing but curiosity. Jack Halloran stepped down from the porch of the main house with the slow, careful stride of a man who had already decided what he was going to say. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with sun-cracked skin and a mustache the color of iron filings. He wore a colt on his hip and a Stetson pushed back on his head to show a pale strip of forehead the sun had never touched. When he stopped beside Angela's wagon, he tipped the hat and offered a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Rearn," he said, "you are a long way from Benson." "I am here on my husband's contract," Angela said. The smile widened. Jack looked at the men gathered along the corral and several of them chuckled before he had finished forming the next sentence. "Ma'am, that contract died with your husband, and it was going to die with Herrera before that, and with Palmer before that. 3 men have signed it. 3 men are in the ground or on their way. I will pay you the balance of what Thomas earned, no argument, and you can turn that wagon around and go home." Angela climbed down from the wagon without answering. She was slight, no taller than 5 feet and 3 inches, and her dark hair had been braided into a single rope down her back. She wore a divided riding skirt of gray canvas, a man's cotton shirt, and boots that had belonged to Thomas and were still a size too large. When her feet touched the ground, she reached back into the wagon and lifted out the leather hackamore. It had no bit. It had no shanks. It was simply a loop of braided rawhide with a knotted nose piece. Jack looked at the hackamore. Then he looked at Angela. Then he turned to the men along the fence and laughed. This time the laugh was longer, and several of the hands laughed with him. "Ma'am," Jack said, wiping the corner of one eye, "that horse behind me tore a snubbing post out of the ground. He killed 2 men who came at him with proper tack, and you propose to work him in a rawhide bosal with no bit and no whip." He shook his head. "I will do you one better than the balance of your husband's pay. You can stay 1 night in the bunkhouse. You can eat 2 meals in the cookhouse. And in the morning I will give you the money Thomas earned and a broom, and you can sweep the porch of the main house for 1 full day at $1.50. That is honest work for an honest woman. Then you go home." Angela did not answer. She walked past Jack, past the laughing hands, past the coffee cups and the coiled ropes, and stopped at the tallest corral. Inside stood a stallion the color of wet obsidian, 16 hands at the withers, deep-chested, with a scar across the bridge of his nose where a lariat had once burned him. When he saw her, he did not charge. He did not scream. He simply stopped moving and watched her with eyes so black they seemed to have no bottom. Angela stood at the rail for a long time. She said nothing to the stallion that first afternoon. She did not enter the corral. She did not raise her hand to him. She simply rested one boot on the lowest rail, laid her forearms across the top rail, and let him look at her for as long as he wished. Behind her, the ranch hands drifted back to their work one by one. Jack Halloran stood on the porch of the main house for a while longer, watching her the way a man watches a bird that has landed on his fence and will not fly away. Eventually, he too disappeared inside. The sun crossed the sky. The stallion did not move from the far corner of the corral, but neither did his eyes leave her. When the light began to soften along the ridges of the dragoons, Angela finally spoke. She spoke in a language none of the ranch hands would have recognized. It was not English and it was not Spanish. It was the language of the Nimiapu, the people white men had learned to call the Nez Percé, and the words she spoke were the first 2 lines of a song her mother had taught her before she was old enough to walk. The song was not for the stallion. It was for her mother. The stallion, however, was the only creature listening, and his ears turned forward for the first time since she had arrived. Angela had grown up on a small horse ranch along the Salmon River in Idaho Territory. Her father, a Kentucky-born horse dealer named William Fletcher, had married a Nez Percé woman named Rose against the wishes of both their families. Rose died of scarlet fever when Angela was 6. What Angela remembered of her mother was mostly a voice, and the songs that voice had carried through the low-ceilinged rooms of the ranch house. What she remembered of her mother's people was mostly one man. His name was Joseph, though he was not the famous Joseph of the war and the surrender. This Joseph was older, a horse trainer who had lived along the Salmon River for 6 decades and who had taught William Fletcher everything Fletcher had ever known worth passing to a daughter. When Angela's mother died, Joseph did not stop coming to the ranch. He came more often. For 11 years, until Angela's father sold the ranch and moved south to Arizona in 1884, Joseph taught Angela how to speak to horses. He did not use a whip. He did not use spurs. He did not use a bit until a horse asked for one, and he had once told Angela that most horses never asked. What Joseph used instead was time. He used breath. He used the quiet placement of his hands. He used tobacco, which he offered to a horse the way another man might offer a lump of sugar, and which the horse learned to associate with the still, unhurried presence of a person who would not hurt him. He used silence, which most white trainers filled with noise. And he used song, though he said the song was not for the horse. The song, he said, was for the trainer, because a person who could sing without fear was a person a horse could trust. Angela had watched Joseph gentle horses that white trainers had given up on. She had watched him gentle a stud so mean the vaqueros had sworn he was possessed. It had taken Joseph 29 days. He had never once raised his voice. That evening, standing at the corral rail while the sun dropped behind the dragoons, Angela reached into her satchel and took out the small tin of tobacco. She opened the tin slowly. The tobacco inside was dark and slightly damp, the way Joseph had once shown her how to keep it, wrapped in a square of oilcloth to hold its scent. She lifted a small pinch between her thumb and forefinger and rubbed it gently in her palm until the warm, sweet smell rose into the still evening air. Then she set the tin on top of the fence post beside her, took another pinch, and let it fall through the rails onto the dirt inside the corral. She did this 3 times. She did not lean forward. She did not call to the stallion. She simply left 3 small offerings on the ground and then stepped back from the rail. The stallion did not move. He watched her walk away toward the bunkhouse with the same unblinking attention he had given her all afternoon. Angela did not look back. Joseph had taught her that as well. When you leave a gift for a horse, you leave it. You do not turn to see whether he accepts it. The gift is not a bargain. The gift is only a gift. The bunkhouse that night was crowded with men who did not want her there. Jack had made a small speech about respecting the widow and no man laying an ill word or an ill hand upon her, and the men had nodded and gone quiet, but the quiet was not friendly. Angela ate her plate of beans and cornbread at the far end of the long table, thanked the cook, and carried her bedroll out to the small tack room behind the main barn. She had already decided she would not sleep in the bunkhouse. She spread her blanket on a bed of clean straw beside a saddle rack and lay down with her back to the wall and her satchel beside her head. The tack room smelled of leather and neatsfoot oil and the faint sweetness of horse. She was asleep within minutes. She woke before the first bird. The Arizona sky above the barn was the color of a pewter cup, and the air still carried the cold of the desert night. Angela pulled on her boots, tied her hair back, and walked out to the tall corral without stopping at the cookhouse. She wanted no company. She wanted no witnesses. Joseph had always worked with the difficult horses at the hour when the world had not yet decided whether it was night or day, and Angela had come to believe he chose that hour for the same reason a priest chooses the hour before dawn for his hardest prayers. The world is honest then. There is no audience. There is only the work. The stallion was standing at the rail when she arrived, not close, perhaps 10 feet back, but he was on her side of the corral for the first time, and the 3 small piles of tobacco she had left the night before were gone. Angela did not know whether he had eaten them or whether the wind had carried them or whether a coyote had slipped through the rails during the dark hours. It did not matter. The gift had been left. The horse had come closer. She rested her forearms on the top rail again, exactly as she had the afternoon before. She did not speak. She did not reach for the hackamore hanging over her shoulder. She simply breathed. The stallion breathed. For nearly an hour, in the pale gray light before the sun cleared the dragoons, a widow and a horse that had killed 2 men stood 20 feet apart and did nothing at all. By the end of the first week, Angela had settled into a rhythm the ranch hands did not understand and could not stop watching. Every morning she rose before the cook lit his stove. Every morning she walked to the tall corral with the tin of tobacco in her pocket and the rawhide hackamore over her shoulder. Every morning she stood at the rail without speaking, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, and left 3 small pinches of tobacco on the ground inside the corral before she walked away. During the day she helped the cook, mended tack in the tack room, and answered the questions of the youngest hand, a boy of 15 named Toby Rains who had lost his own mother the previous spring, and had taken to following Angela the way a colt follows a lead mare. Every evening she returned to the corral one more time, at the hour when the light turned the color of a peach skin, and she sang. She sang the songs her mother had taught her. She sang them in the language of the Nimiapu, and she sang them softly, and she did not sing them for the horse. Jack Halloran watched all of this from the porch of the main house with a growing expression of impatience. Twice during the first week he came down to the corral and asked her when she intended to actually enter the pen. Both times Angela answered him with the same sentence, "When he asks me to." The second time she said it, Jack laughed until his eyes watered. "Ma'am," he finally said, wiping his mustache, "that horse is never going to ask you a thing. That horse killed Palmer. That horse killed Herrera. That horse does not ask. That horse tells." "Then I will wait until he tells me," Angela said, and she turned back toward the rail. By the end of the second week, three things had changed. The first was the stallion. He no longer stood at the far corner of the corral when Angela arrived. He stood at the near rail. When she rested her forearms on the top board, he was often close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath through the gap between the rails. He did not let her touch him. He did not let her lift a hand toward him. But he stood, and he watched her. And once, on the morning of the 11th day, he lowered his head and picked up the pinch of tobacco she had dropped inside the corral and worked it slowly around his mouth before letting it fall back to the dirt. The second thing that changed was the sky. Angela noticed it before anyone else on the ranch. The clouds that usually built above the dragoons in the late afternoon, the tall white anvils that promised the summer monsoons, did not build. The sky above Sand Creek stayed a hard, high, empty blue from horizon to horizon. The wind that came down from the mountains carried no smell of water. The mesquite trees along the wash began to drop their smaller leaves 3 weeks too early. Angela had seen the same signs once before, along the Salmon River in the summer of 1877, and she remembered what Joseph had said that summer. When the sky forgets to work, the wells will forget too. The third thing that changed was Toby Raines. On the 14th day, the boy came to Angela in the tack room at midday, his hat crushed in both hands, and asked whether he might watch her work with the stallion at dawn. Angela considered him for a long moment. "You may watch," she said, "but you may not speak." Toby was at the corral before her the next morning. He had climbed onto the top rail of an adjoining pen, 40 feet away, so that his shape would not loom above the stallion's line of sight. He had left his spurs in the bunkhouse. He had wrapped his tin cup in a piece of flannel so that it would not clink against the buckle of his belt. Angela saw all of these small courtesies without commenting on them, and she nodded to him once before she turned to the rail. That morning, for the first time, she entered the corral. She did not open the gate. Joseph had taught her that a gate was a loud thing, and a horse that had learned to fear men had usually learned to fear the sound of a gate. Instead, Angela set one boot on the lowest rail, swung her other leg over the top, and lowered herself to the inside of the pen with the smooth, unhurried motion of a woman climbing into her own kitchen. She did not walk toward the stallion. She walked 3 steps away from him, turned her back to him, and stood facing the empty far corner of the corral with her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She began to hum. It was one of her mother's songs, a low melody with no words. Behind her, she could hear the stallion breathing. She could hear the soft sound of his hooves in the dirt as he shifted his weight. She did not turn. She did not look. She simply hummed and waited, and after a period of time that Toby Raines would later swear was closer to an hour than a minute, she felt the warm, grass-scented breath of a 16-hand Mustang against the back of her neck. She still did not turn. She lifted her left hand, palm up, and held it out slightly behind her at the level of her hip. A pinch of tobacco lay in the center of her palm. The stallion's muzzle brushed her fingers. She felt his lip move. The tobacco was gone. Angela closed her hand slowly and let it fall back to her side. Then she walked, without hurrying, toward the rail she had climbed over, and she climbed back out of the corral the same way she had come in. Toby Raines did not speak all the way back to the bunkhouse. When they reached the yard, he stopped and stared at her. "Ma'am," he finally said, "ma'am, that horse killed Palmer." "That horse was afraid of Palmer," Angela said. "He ain't afraid of you. Not this morning." The days after that ran together in Toby's memory the way the pages of a well-read book run together in the memory of a child. Angela entered the corral every dawn. She never carried a whip. She never carried a rope. She carried tobacco and she carried her mother's songs, and on the 18th morning she carried the rawhide hackamore over her shoulder, and she laid it on the ground inside the corral and left it there and walked out. On the 19th morning, the hackamore was still on the ground where she had left it. On the 20th morning, the stallion was standing over it, with his nose lowered to the braided rawhide as though reading a letter he had once been afraid to open. While all of this was happening in the tall corral at dawn, the wells of Cochise County were beginning to fail. The first to go dry was the shallow well at the Kettering place, 16 miles to the south. The Kettering well went dry on a Tuesday. By Friday of the same week, the well at the Vasquez homestead had followed it. By the following Wednesday, 3 more wells along the San Pedro had lowered to a level so foul with silt and cattle salt that the water could no longer be drunk by anything larger than a chicken. The ranchers of Cochise County had lived through dry summers before, and at first they told each other this was only another one. They rationed. They hauled water in barrels from the springs at Dragoon Pass. They cut their herds by a third and drove the culled cattle north to the railroad at Wilcox before the animals could lose too much weight to sell. They did not yet panic. Panic was a luxury the frontier did not permit itself until the last barrel was empty. But the Sand Creek Ranch was larger than any of its neighbors, and its herd was larger, and its well was deeper. And when Sand Creek's well began to drop in the 3rd week of drought, Jack Halloran started to sleep badly. He was, for all his laughter and his mustache and his slow porch stride, a foreman responsible for 4,000 head of cattle and 11 ranch hands, and the wages of the cook and the boy Toby Raines and the widow he had tried to send home with a broom. He walked the yard at night. He stood at the mouth of the well and dropped a stone and counted the seconds until he heard the small, tired sound of the stone striking water. Each week, the count grew longer. By the 23rd day of Angela's work with the stallion, the count at the Sand Creek well had grown to a length that made Jack Halloran stop counting. That was the morning he came down to the tall corral for the first time since Angela had entered it. He stood at the rail with his hat in his hands. He did not speak while she worked. He watched her walk into the pen, lay the hackamore across the stallion's withers, lift her hand to the base of his mane, and stand there with her fingers resting lightly against the black hair while the horse breathed steadily and did not move. He watched her lift the braided nose piece over the stallion's muzzle and settle it into place without a bit and without a bridle, and he watched her lead the horse 3 slow circles around the corral with nothing but a rawhide rein and the sound of her voice. When she was finished, she removed the hackamore, laid it on the ground, walked to the rail, and climbed out. Jack was still holding his hat. "Mrs. Rearn," he said. "Mr. Halloran." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the ground. He looked at the stallion. He looked at the sky, which was the same hard, high, empty blue it had been for 6 weeks. Then he looked at Angela. "The well is going," he said. "The Kettering place is dry. The Vasquez place is dry. Dragoon Pass is down to a trickle. If this valley does not find water in the next fortnight, we will lose the herd, not part of the herd. The herd." He turned the hat in his hands. "The mustangs know springs no rancher does. Every man in this county knows that, and no man in this county will say it out loud because no man in this county can ride a mustang." He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Angela looked at him for a long time. "I will ride him," Angela said. Jack lowered his eyes to the hat in his hands. Whatever he had rehearsed on his walk down from the porch, he did not say it. He simply nodded once and he asked her what she needed. Angela's list was short. A canteen of 2 gallons. A second canteen of 1 gallon, a small sack of jerked beef and hardtack, a folded square of oilcloth, a compass, though she had already told him she would not need one, a blanket, and a promise made in front of Toby Raines and the cook and 2 of the older hands that if she did not return by sundown of the 2nd day, no man from the ranch would ride out after her. The country she was going into was broken and dry and full of arroyos that had killed better trackers than any man at Sand Creek, and she would not have a search party dying on her account. Jack gave the promise. He did not like giving it, but he gave it. She left the ranch 2 hours before dawn the next morning. She rode the stallion in the rawhide hackamore, with no saddle, only the folded wool blanket cinched loosely with a length of soft rope. The stallion carried her out of the yard at a slow walk. He did not toss his head. He did not shy at the shape of the barn against the fatting stars. When they reached the open ground beyond the corrals, Angela let him have his head, and the stallion did not run. He walked. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of an animal that had been born to this country and knew exactly where he was going, and Angela did not lift the rein once during the first hour. She had thought about this ride for many days. She had thought about what Joseph had told her about mustangs, which was that a wild horse does not know the location of water the way a man knows the location of his kitchen. A wild horse knows the location of water the way a man's tongue knows the location of a missing tooth. The knowledge is not in his mind. It is in his body. It is in the small, unthinking corrections he makes with his ears and his nostrils and the muscles along his jaw. If a rider tries to steer such a horse, the knowledge disappears. If a rider surrenders, the knowledge returns. Angela surrendered. She rode with the softest possible pressure of her knees, and she let the rein hang. She let the stallion choose the wash he wanted to follow when the sun rose. She let him choose the ridge he wanted to climb when the shadow of a hawk crossed their path at mid-morning. She let him stop when he wanted to stop, and drink from the canteen when she offered it, and she let him graze the few pale shoots of grama grass he found in the shade of a mesquite at noon. By the middle of the first afternoon, they were in country Angela had never seen. The land here rose in long, broken benches of red rock, split by arroyos so deep that a rider could disappear into one and be invisible from 100 yards away. There were no fence lines. There were no trails. There was no sign that a white man had ever passed through this country with any purpose beyond crossing it as quickly as possible. The stallion walked on. He turned east where a man would have turned south. He climbed a bench where a man would have gone around. He found the first spring an hour before sunset. It was in a place no rancher would ever have thought to look. A narrow cleft in the red rock at the base of a broken bench, hidden behind a stand of scrub oak so thick that Angela did not see the water until the stallion had already pushed his muzzle into it. She dismounted slowly. She knelt beside the pool. It was no larger than a wagon wheel, but it was clear and it was cold, and when she cupped her hand into it, the water was sweet on her tongue. She drank. She let the stallion drink. She refilled the canteen. Then she took a small piece of red flannel from her satchel, tore it in half, and tied one half to the branch of the scrub oak nearest the water. The other half she tucked back into her satchel. Joseph had taught her to mark a spring twice. Once for the eye and once for the memory. She slept that night on the bench above the spring, wrapped in the wool blanket with the stallion picketed on a long, soft line beside her. She did not build a fire. The stars above the dragoons were bright enough to read by. She lay on her back and she watched them, and she thought of Thomas, and she thought of her mother, and she thought of Joseph, who had been dead now nearly 2 years but whose voice she could still hear as clearly as if he were sitting beside her in the dark. When you find water in a dry country, Joseph had once told her, you do not own it. You are only the person the water has agreed to let carry the news. The second spring the stallion found her at mid-morning of the second day. It lay at the head of an arroyo 6 miles east of the first, and it was larger, a slow, steady seep that filled a stone basin the size of a bathtub before spilling into the sand and disappearing. The third spring he found 2 hours before noon, in a place so unlikely that Angela laughed out loud when she saw it. It was on the shaded side of a rock face that faced almost due north, in country that any rancher who knew the valley would have sworn could not hold water at any depth. But the water was there. It ran in a thin, bright thread down the rock and pooled in a bowl of clean sand at the base, and the stallion drank from it as though he had been drinking from it since he was a foal, which he very likely had. Angela tied a strip of red flannel at each of the 3 springs. She marked each of them in a small notebook she carried in her satchel, using landmarks a surveyor would have understood: the shoulder of a bench, the bearing of a distant peak, the count of paces from a particular scrub oak to the nearest edge of standing water. She did not draw a map. She wrote the map in words, because words were harder for another rider to steal from her satchel while she slept. She rode back into the yard at Sand Creek 2 hours before sundown of the second day, exactly as she had promised Jack Halloran she would. The stallion was tired. She was tired. Her lips were cracked. Her hands were raw from the rain. But she sat straight on the black horse as he walked her past the corrals, and every man on the ranch stopped what he was doing to watch her come in. Jack Halloran was on the porch. He came down the steps slowly. She did not dismount. She looked down at Jack from the back of the stallion, and she told him, in the same quiet voice she had used the morning she said she would ride the horse, that she had found 3 springs. She told him that all 3 lay on land no rancher in Cochise County had ever claimed, land the surveyors had passed over because it looked worthless from the road. She told him that she intended to ride into Tombstone at first light and file homestead claims on all 3 parcels under the widow's homestead provision of the amended Act of 1873, which permitted a woman who had buried her husband to file on a full quarter section in her own name without a male witness. Then she dismounted, and she led the stallion to the water trough, and she stood beside him while he drank. Jack Halloran did not stop her. He did not ask her to share the locations. He did not ask her to sign the claims over to the ranch. He simply watched her, and after a long moment he took his hat off and held it against his chest, and he said the only word Angela had ever heard him say without a laugh underneath it. "Ma'am." She rode into Tombstone the following morning on the black stallion, and she filed the 3 claims before the land office had been open a full hour. The clerk read her paperwork twice. He looked at her twice. Then he stamped the 3 deeds and handed them across the counter, and Angela folded them into the same oilcloth square she had carried her map in, and she rode home. The ranchers of Cochise County came to her within the week. They came singly at first, then in pairs, then in delegations. Jack Halloran came first among them, and he came with his hat in his hands, and he did not ask her a favor. He asked her a price. Angela had already decided the price. She had decided it on the second night on the bench above the first spring, watching the stars, thinking of Joseph. She would sell water at a fair rate, the same rate to every rancher, the poorest and the largest paying the same per barrel. She would not gouge. She would not withhold. But she would insist on written contracts, signed and witnessed and filed at the courthouse in Tombstone, because a promise made to a widow in a dry summer had a way of being forgotten in a wet spring. The ranchers signed. Every one of them signed. Elias Kettering signed. Emilio Vasquez signed. Jack Halloran signed on behalf of Sand Creek, and his signature was steady, and when he laid the pen down he looked at Angela and he said, "Mrs. Rearn, I owe you an apology I do not know how to shape." And Angela said, "You do not owe me an apology, Mr. Halloran. You owe me the second $30 on my husband's contract." And Jack Halloran paid her in silver on the porch of the main house in front of every hand at Sand Creek. The stallion lived with Angela for another 19 years. She never sold him. She never bred him to any mare but her own. When she died in the winter of 1908, Toby Raines, who was by then the foreman of his own ranch, rode out to bury her. He buried her beside the first spring, under the scrub oak where the red flannel had once hung. He buried the stallion beside her 4 months later. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more frontier tales of the women history nearly forgot.